You know, it's interesting people who seem the strongest on the outside are often the ones holding the most fragile walls inside. Avoidants are like that. They build fortresses instead of homes. They convince themselves that needing someone means losing control, so they learn to live behind emotional walls. They stay in relationships, but they don't let themselves be fully in them. They fear being consumed by closeness, so they push away the very people who try to love them. But here's the tragedy: one day they lose that person who actually cared, the one who saw through their defenses, who didn't run when things got complicated, who stayed even when it was hard, and that's when the cracks begin to show. At first, they'll act like they're fine. They'll tell themselves they needed space, that it's better this way, that freedom feels lighter than commitment. They might even look happier posting photos, diving into work, or surrounding themselves with distractions. But when the noise quiets and the nights grow long, something shifts, because for the first time, they don't have someone waiting at the other end of their silence. Avoidants fall apart in private. They won't admit it. They won't text you to say they miss you. They won't show up at your door crying. Instead, they'll replay moments in their head: the warmth of your voice, the safety of your presence, the peace that came from being seen without judgment. And that memory will haunt them because they realize too late that the love they pushed away was the love that grounded them. What they never expected was that emotional distance comes with a cost. When they lose someone who actually cared, they also lose the mirror that reflected their softer side, the side they've spent years trying to hide. That's when the loneliness hits differently. It's not just about missing a person, it's about missing the version of themselves that person brought out. And you see, the thing about avoidance is that they don't fall apart loudly, they unravel quietly in subtle ways. They overthink old texts, scroll through old photos, and remember small things you said that felt meaningless at the time but now echo in their silence. It's a slow realization that running from intimacy doesn't protect them, it isolates them. But here's the truth: avoidants don't need punishment, they need awareness. What breaks them isn't losing love, it's realizing they never learned how to receive it. Healing begins when they stop seeing vulnerability as weakness and start seeing it as strength. Because love isn't supposed to threaten your independence, it's meant to expand it. And maybe, when the pain settles, they'll look back and understand the person who cared wasn't trying to trap them. They were trying to meet them, but sometimes we only learn the value of emotional safety when we've already lost it. So, to the avoidant who's hurting, you didn't fail because you couldn't love perfectly. You failed because you didn't let love in, but the good news: the door is still there. The next time someone reaches for you, try opening it, even just a little, because no matter how tough you think you are, everyone eventually realizes connection isn't what weakens you. It's what makes you whole. Avoidants often move through life with an unspoken belief that needing someone is dangerous. Somewhere along the way, they learned that closeness comes with risk, the risk of rejection, abandonment, or disappointment. So, they build invisible walls around their hearts and convince themselves that staying distant keeps them safe. They crave connection, just like everyone else, but the moment it begins to feel real, they start to retreat. They tell themselves it's about independence, about not wanting to lose control, but deep down, it's fear of being seen too deeply, fear that once someone truly knows them, they'll leave. To an avoidant, love feels like surrender, and surrender feels like weakness. When someone genuinely cares for them, they start to feel exposed. The consistency, affection, and emotional availability of the other person can feel overwhelming. It's not that they don't appreciate it, it's that it shines a light on the parts of themselves they've worked hard to keep hidden. They might withdraw, become distant, or even create conflict to re-establish emotional space. To them, that distance feels safe, it restores a sense of control. But in doing so, they push away the very love that was meant to heal them. Avoidants don't realize that in trying to protect their hearts, they also starve them. They build emotional walls to avoid pain, not realizing those walls keep out the warmth, affection, and security they secretly long for. This misunderstanding often creates cycles of loneliness. They may end relationships or sabotage them, believing they're preserving their independence. But when the quiet sets in, when the messages stop and the calls no longer come, they feel the ache of the emptiness they've created. It's not that they don't care, it's that caring feels unsafe. Their logic tells them to retreat, but their heart whispers for connection. This internal battle wears them down over time, because you can only silence your emotional needs for so long before they start screaming for attention. The truth is, emotional safety doesn't mean losing control. It means trusting someone enough to be yourself without fear of judgment. It means realizing that vulnerability isn't the opposite of strength, it's what gives strength depth and meaning. For avoidants, this understanding often comes after they've lost someone who genuinely cared. Only then do they realize that the person who tried to love them wasn't trying to take away their freedom. They were trying to build a partnership that could hold both love and independence. Avoidants often confuse the feeling of safety with the feeling of being trapped because they've never known what healthy safety feels like. When they finally recognize that letting someone in doesn't mean giving up control, they begin to soften. They start to understand that true security isn't built through isolation but through trust. Emotional safety doesn't take away independence. It strengthens it by allowing them to stand confidently, knowing they're loved for who they are. The irony is that the control they fought to protect was never real control, it was fear in disguise. Real control comes from emotional maturity, from knowing that love can exist without losing yourself. When avoidants learn this truth, their walls begin to crack not from weakness, but from the quiet courage it takes to let love in. When an avoidant loses someone who truly cared for them, their breakdown doesn't happen in the way most people expect. On the surface, they appear calm, composed, even relieved. They may tell themselves that it's better this way, that they needed space, or that the relationship was becoming too demanding. They might throw themselves into work, hobbies, or social distractions to fill the sudden emptiness. To everyone around them, they seem fine, maybe even thriving, but that's the illusion. The truth is, avoidants don't fall apart publicly. They collapse quietly behind closed doors in the silence they once thought they wanted. At first, they feel a rush of control. No more expectations, no more emotional responsibility, no more feeling exposed. But after the noise fades, when the messages stop coming and no one checks in on them anymore, something begins to shift. The silence that once brought them peace starts to echo. They notice the absence of the person who used to understand their pauses, who made effort even when they withdrew, who stayed patient through their distance. And that's when the unraveling begins, not suddenly, but in slow, invisible waves. They start to replay old moments in their minds. Maybe it's the sound of that person's laughter, a small inside joke, or the warmth in their voice when they said good night. These memories come uninvited, sometimes during quiet nights, sometimes in the middle of the day. And for a moment, the avoidant feels something they can't quite name: regret, longing, maybe both. But instead of facing those feelings, they try to push them away again, convincing themselves that emotions make them weak. The irony is that the more they resist the feelings, the more power those memories gain. The quiet becomes heavier because it's filled with all the things they never said, all the moments they never allowed themselves to feel fully. Avoidants fall apart not through tears or breakdowns, but through overthinking. They analyze every word, every look, every silence, searching for reasons, for justification, for closure they can control. But love isn't logical, and loss can't be rationalized away. The emotional numbness they depend on eventually cracks, and beneath it lies the truth that the person they lost was never trying to take away their freedom, only to give them a space where they could be loved safely. It's in that realization that the loneliness becomes almost unbearable, because now they know what real care feels like and they know they pushed it away. The pain of that awareness lingers quietly. They may never admit it to anyone, sometimes not even to themselves, but deep inside, they know that the silence they fought for came at the cost of connection. They realize that independence without intimacy feels hollow, that solitude is not the same as peace. Their collapse isn't visible to the world. It happens in private moments, in the stillness of their thoughts, in the ache of what they lost, and in the haunting awareness that the person who once reached for them isn't reaching anymore. When an avoidant loses someone who truly cared, the pain runs deeper than they expect, because it's not just the person they miss, it's the version of themselves that person helped them become. Love has a way of reflecting parts of us we didn't know existed. For avoidants, who spend so much of their lives guarded and detached, being with someone patient and emotionally safe can feel like stepping into a light they never believed was for them. They start to soften without realizing it. They laugh more, share small details, allow brief moments of closeness, and even begin to trust. In the presence of real care, their defenses lower, and for a while, they feel seen in a way that feels both terrifying and comforting. It's in that safety that their true self, gentle, open, and vulnerable, starts to emerge. But when that person leaves, that version of them disappears too. Suddenly, the parts of themselves that came alive in love retreat back into the shadows. The quiet confidence they had when they were accepted turns into self-doubt. The comfort of being understood turns into loneliness. They don't just lose a partner. They lose the emotional mirror that showed them they could be warm, affectionate, and capable of connection. For avoidants, this is one of the most painful realizations, that love didn't change who they were. It revealed who they always had the potential to be. In the aftermath, they may try to tell themselves that it's better this way, that they're fine on their own. But deep down, they feel the absence of that emotional version of themselves, the one who allowed softness, who dared to care, who trusted even when it felt risky. They remember how easy it was to talk to that person, how naturally they felt accepted, how safe it was to just be. That feeling becomes a quiet ache, because it wasn't only about being loved, it was about being able to love without fear. Losing that connection makes them question whether they'll ever feel that safe again, whether anyone else will ever bring out that side of them. As time passes, they may try to rebuild their emotional armor, pretending that the loss didn't change them. But the truth is, it did. The relationship left an imprint, a memory of what it felt like to be emotionally alive. And no amount of denial can erase that. They might scroll through old photos or replay conversations, not because they want to go back, but because they're trying to reconnect with the part of themselves that only existed in that love. It's not just nostalgia, it's a longing for the self they lost. What they eventually come to understand is that the tenderness they showed wasn't dependent on that person, it was already within them. That relationship simply gave it permission to surface. When they lose someone who truly cared, they're not only grieving the relationship, they're grieving their own openness, the fragile version of themselves that dared to love and be loved. And until they find the courage to reopen their heart, they continue to miss not just the other person, but the best parts of themselves that love once brought to life. Healing for an avoidant doesn't begin the moment they lose someone, it begins the moment they stop running from what that loss is trying to teach them. Avoidants often spend their lives believing that vulnerability is dangerous, that showing emotion means giving up power. They learn to rely on logic instead of feeling, to stay calm when others cry, and to stay distant when others reach out. But emotional detachment is not strength. It's a form of self-protection that eventually becomes self-sabotage. When they lose someone who genuinely cared, the emptiness that follows exposes the truth that distance doesn't protect them, it isolates them. That realization is where healing begins, but only if they have the courage to face it. At first, most avoidants resist. They bury themselves in distractions or convince themselves that love just isn't meant for them. They say things like, "I'm better on my own," or "I don't need anyone," hoping that repetition will make it true. But somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispers otherwise. That voice reminds them of what it felt like to be understood, to have someone who cared enough to stay even when they were difficult to reach. And as much as they try to silence that voice, it grows louder with time. Eventually, they realize that the avoidance wasn't strength, it was fear. They weren't pushing people away because they didn't care they were doing it, because they were terrified of caring too much. Healing then becomes a process of unlearning. They must unlearn the belief that closeness equals weakness, that dependence equals danger, that love always leads to pain. They must start small, maybe by opening up to a friend, by expressing a feeling without retreating, or by allowing someone to comfort them without guilt. These small acts of vulnerability are uncomfortable at first. They trigger the same old fears of rejection and loss, but with each step, they discover that vulnerability doesn't destroy them. In fact, it strengthens them. It builds emotional resilience because being open means trusting yourself to handle whatever happens next, whether it's love, loss, or uncertainty. For an avoidant, the hardest part of healing is surrendering control. They've spent so long managing how much they feel, say, or reveal that true openness feels foreign. But the moment they let go of that control, something shifts. They start to see love not as a threat, but as a shared experience, something that doesn't take away from them, but adds to them. They begin to understand that real intimacy isn't about losing freedom. It's about creating safety. It's about being able to stand next to someone without armor and still feel secure. Over time, they start to see that the strength they were chasing through avoidance was always within them. It was never about staying detached, it was about learning to stay present. When they stop running from their emotions and start facing them, healing becomes possible. The walls they built to protect themselves start to crumble, not from weakness, but from the courage it takes to admit they no longer need them. Avoidants often grow up believing that love and freedom can't exist together. To them, intimacy feels like surrender, like giving someone else the power to dictate their happiness or pain. They fear that getting too close means losing themselves, so they keep a distance that feels safe. But what they don't realize is that real love doesn't confine, it liberates. Love, in its truest form, doesn't take away independence, it expands it by creating a space where both people can be fully themselves without fear. The problem is, avoidants have spent so long associating closeness with control that they can't see how love can coexist with autonomy. When someone genuinely cares for them, they often misinterpret it as pressure. They confuse emotional availability with neediness, affection with dependency, and care with control. In their attempt to preserve independence, they end up isolating themselves. They pull away just when the relationship starts to deepen because they think distance equals safety. But when they lose the person who cared, the emptiness that follows forces them to confront the truth that freedom without connection doesn't feel like freedom at all. It feels like loneliness disguised as strength. Love, at its healthiest, is not about possession, it's about partnership. It doesn't demand that you shrink to fit someone else's expectations. It invites you to grow alongside them. For avoidance, understanding this concept is transformative. It means realizing that emotional closeness isn't something that takes away from their sense of self, it's something that enriches it. When they finally stop viewing love as a cage, they begin to experience it as a collaboration between two independent souls. The relationship becomes a place where vulnerability and strength can coexist, where being open doesn't mean being weak, and where being cared for doesn't mean being controlled. This shift in perspective often happens slowly. It starts when they begin to see how much energy they've spent trying to maintain emotional distance. They notice that the control they fought to keep only left them exhausted. They start to realize that letting someone in doesn't mean losing control. It means trusting themselves enough to handle intimacy without fear. And that's where true empowerment begins. Real freedom isn't about isolation, it's about choice. It's about being able to choose connection without feeling trapped by it. When an avoidant learns to love without fear, they discover a different kind of independence, one built on trust, emotional safety, and mutual respect. They learn that being loved doesn't make them smaller, it makes them more whole. They stop running from commitment because they understand that love isn't about being owned, it's about being seen. And once they experience love that honors their individuality instead of threatening it, everything changes. They realize that love and freedom were never enemies, they were always meant to walk hand in hand. Love doesn't confine their spirit, it gives it room to breathe. It doesn't take away their identity, it gives it a place to belong. In the end, the journey of the avoidant is not about blame, but about awakening, realizing that love was never the enemy, fear was. The walls they built to feel safe only kept them from the very connection their soul longed for. Healing begins the moment they understand that vulnerability doesn't take away their strength, it reveals it. Because true love isn't meant to confine or control, it's meant to free. So, to anyone who has ever loved an avoidant or been one, remember love doesn't break you, it builds you when you let it in. Thank you for listening, and may we all find the courage to love a little deeper and live a little braver.